Tonight's video is the first video as part of our unit on evolution. The video itself is going to follow along with Chapter 22, Descent with Modification, a Darwinian View, in our textbook. And really, this video is about how the theory of evolution has developed over time, and that current modern research continues to support the theory as it's been laid out. So I have a couple of learning objectives for us with this chapter. One is that you need to be able to explain that the theory of evolution has developed over time with the work of several scientists across multiple fields. You also need to be able to explain that evolution is currently the accepted theory and that modern research techniques continue to support the theory of evolution laid out by Charles Darwin. All right, so I'm expecting you to be able to reference the different findings of the scientists that we're going to cover as part of this topic, and how they support this idea that there is a common ancestor for all living organisms on Earth, and that we have evolved from that common ancestor over millions of years. As part of the assignment, you should have already completed this on Guru. But you were asked to do a what do you think and what do you see, where you explain what's going on in this comic, okay? So if you have not done so, please go ahead and do that before continuing with this video. It's helpful for me to know what you know about evolution at this point, and also any misconceptions that we may need to discuss in class. So when we talk about the diversity of species on Earth, there are thousands of different living organisms that range from animals, including us as humans, to plants and fish and reptiles, even all the way to single-cell organisms like bacteria. Now, each of these organisms is very unique in its own way, but when we start to take a closer look, there's going to be some common features amongst closely related organisms, and even amongst distantly related organisms there will be common features, okay? And so this is part of what supports this idea that there is a common ancestor for all living organisms on Earth, because when we look at bacteria, for example, and humans, okay, there's not much that we have in common, but at the base level, okay, we still use DNA, and that DNA is believed to help tie all the different organisms on Earth back to this one common ancestor. But let's take a look at a family of organisms, and that's of the primates. Okay, in the primates we have chimpanzees, and we have gorillas, and humans. We are part of that as Homo sapiens. We also have lemurs, and New World monkeys, and Old World monkeys. Orangutans are also part of this family too. So when we look at this diversity of species within the family of primates here, you may say, well, there's not too much in common that we have amongst all of us. Okay. Some primates have tails, some primates don't have tails. And we'll talk more about it, but we do have what's referred to as a vestigial tail. And vestigial is going to be one of the words as part of our vocabulary that we'll learn about here in the near future. But our eyes are relatively similar. We generally have a fur-covered body because we're part of the animal species. Some of us have thumbs, some of us use tools. So there are a lot of common features between us and the rest of the primates. Does that mean that we're exactly alike? No. Okay. So even though Homo sapiens, humans, are part of the primate family, there are vast differences between us and some of our closest relatives like the chimpanzee. Does this mean that we evolved from chimpanzees? No. We're going to talk more about evolution and what that exactly means. But at one point, what this means is that chimpanzees and Homo sapiens did have a common ancestor, okay? And that could have been thousands, if not millions of years ago. So don't worry, you are not directly descended from a chimpanzee. They are just closely related to us when we start to look at different features and then move to the molecular and biochemical levels. So on this slide here, we have what's referred to as the phylogenetic tree of life. And what the tree of life shows is it shows an overview of all the relationships between the different groups and families and how they're all related to each other back to the common ancestor. So, for example, if we look at eukarya eukaryota here, that is where we are as animals. Okay. You can see that we have a close relationship to fungus, plants, slime molds, which we don't know much about here in this class, but we will learn a little bit more over the course of the year. And so wherever there is a junction, okay, where the lines come together, that means that at some point there was a common ancestor. And from that common ancestor through evolution, we have further split off from that organism. And if we go back in time, okay, and that's what this tree is showing here, is a history of time, we eventually get to this point where the different groupings of species comes together. And it's at this point that is what's referred to as the common ancestor. This common ancestor does not have much in common with us as animals anymore, but at the very basic level, this is the most basic living organism that came into being with the use of DNA. And from that, over time, we've evolved and we've become bacteria, archaea, eukaryota, and we continue to evolve even to this day. Does evolution happen overnight? No. It happens over generations, okay? And so depending on the type of organism you are, that generation can be very short or it can be very long. This is a very long process, but we can see through the use of fossils and living organisms evidence of common ancestors and connections between the different organisms. The modern theory of evolution is credited with Charles Darwin publishing his manuscript in 1859 called On the Origin of Species. But the work of Charles Darwin was not isolated. He built his theory based not only on the observations that he made over the course of his travels, but also on the scientific knowledge of the time. We really need to begin by discussing the theory of evolution with Aristotle. And Aristotle laid down the basis of what he thought all living organisms consist of back in 384 BC. Now, that's not to say that Aristotle was right on everything, but Aristotle did spend a lot of time thinking about the scientific and math communities. The next real big step in the theory of evolution was the development of what's called the binomial naming scheme, and that was developed by Carolus Linnaeus in 1707, somewhere around there. And we will learn more about that over the course of this unit. Linnaeus was a biologist himself, and he came up with a naming scheme for us to organize all the living organisms that are known about. From there, we have work that was done by Georges Cuvier, who was a paleontologist, and James Hunn, who was a geologist. And both of them looked at sedimentary rock and fossils and developed this idea that life has been changing over the course of time. How that happens or why that happens was unknown. But we can look at the fossil rocks and the evidence that's present there and see that there is a change in life forms over time. And then we move on to Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who was a French biologist. And his theory of how adaptation happens in evolution, although proven wrong, was a theory of the time. And Lamarck really thought that evolution happened, that traits changed for organisms based on use. And so we'll talk more about that here in a minute. But it was ultimately proven to not be correct in that theory. And then by the time Charles Darwin leaves on the HMS Beagle, which is where he collects most of his data to write his manuscript, he does return and writes the manuscript, but then sits on the manuscript for a long period of time. And it's not until Alfred Russel Wallace presents his own hypothesis on natural selection and evolution that Charles Darwin finally publishes his manuscript. Now, most people are familiar with Charles Darwin. Alfred Wallace, though, came to the same conclusion that Charles Darwin did. We just know the origin of species better than Wallace's work. And so since the 1859, we've had this complete theory of evolution. Now, we've added to it since then, and that's been because of the development of modern technology to further study evolution, the relationship of species, and we'll talk more about that in the future. But the theory of evolution still stands to this day. Carolus Linnaeus was born in 1707 and died in 1778. His career was that of a physician and a botanist from Sweden. And Linnaeus's interest in the sciences was centered around how we organized and named different species of creatures. At this point, the only thing that we really had to develop a system of organization based off of was the physical attributes or features of the organism. And that included through dissection too and looking at bone structure. But what he did was he took plants and animals and he started to group them together based on these common features. And the names were based off of Latin names because at that time science was often Latin. And so he came up with what was referred to as a binomial naming scheme. All right? And so the first part of the name was the genus, and the second part of the name was the specific species. Okay? And from there, then, he was able to group together organisms into more and more general categories until like organisms were paired with like organisms, and till we moved further and further out to kingdoms and eventually domains. As an example of his naming system, I have two different species of praying mantis here. Both of these are found in Africa. One is Sphodromantis viridis, the African praying mantis. So Sphodromantis being the genus and viridis being the species. And the other one is the giant African praying mantis, which is Sphodromantis basseti. And so you can see based on both of these that they are similar organisms because they are both of the same species, Sphodromantis, but they are different based on their specific species names. Our next scientist that helped influence Charles Darwin's work is that of Georges Cuvier, who was born in 1769 and lived to 1832. Cuvier did not actually believe in evolution. Evolution was a theory that had been thrown around during his time. And really, what we'll come to find out is Darwin's really responsible for coming up with a means by which evolution happens. So Cuvier here does not believe in evolution. He was one of the earliest paleontologists. He spent his time studying the fossils in the different strata of the sedimentary rock found outside of Paris, his home city. And he came to a couple of conclusions based on looking at the fossils that were in this rock. The first is that the deeper you go into the different strata, meaning older rock layers, the more dissimilar the fossils became from modern species found in the area. And so he was of the belief that the deeper that the fossil was found, the older it had to be and less similar to modern species. His second conclusion was that he noticed that some species disappear after a while and new ones appear in the different strata. And his conclusion based on this, as a follower of a theory called catastrophism, was that the reason why some of these fossils disappeared in different strata was because a catastrophe had taken place. Okay, and so catastrophes do happen, but his theory was that these catastrophes would wipe out that species, or most of it, to where no further fossils would be found. And this catastrophe could be a flood, or a fire, or earthquake, or volcano, a variety of different catastrophes. And his explanation for new fossils appearing in different layers of strata was that these new species must have moved in from somewhere else to replace the species that had been lost due to the catastrophe. Now, by the time Charles Darwin comes around, this theory has kind of lost favor. Catastrophism, we know now, is not correct, but it was an important influence on the work of Charles Darwin and what he set out to prove as to that evolution really is true, and that as a theory, it supports the evidence of what we see as scientists. Continuing with the studying of fossils, we come to James Hunt, who lived from 1726 to 1797. James Hunt was interested in the changes that occurred on the Earth and looking at the geological structures that are present. And so based on his work, he proposed that the Earth was changing at a very gradual process and did not support the idea that catastrophes happen frequently and that we're the responsible parties for all the changes that take place on Earth. And so what his proposal did was it provides evidence that the Earth was much older than originally proposed, because these geological formations and changes that take place took much longer than scientists at the time had originally thought. His other involvement and support, which would lead to evolution's evidence, was that the idea that fossils were made from marine life being buried by the erosion of rock and carried by rivers and streams to seas and oceans, where it would slowly but continuously bury the Dead Sea creatures at that area. And then these marine life fossils would eventually be elevated to above the water surface, and now we would be able to look at those fossils. Our second geologist of the time was that of Charles Lyell. Now, Charles Lyell was born in 1797 and lived to 1875. He was one of the leading geologists at the time of Charles Darwin's work, and his work was in support of what Hunt was saying. And this would influence Darwin by proposing that, just like the Earth, that biological species changed gradually over time, and that it wasn't a catastrophe or a quick process that led to evolution. And so, using Hutton's work, what Lyell developed was this principle of uniformitarianism. And so uniformitarianism basically states that the changes that were taking place early in Earth's history are still taking place today because they are a gradual and continuous process that does not change. Okay, and so we can look at this as the movement of the continents and the uplifting of land masses and erosion of land masses back into seas and oceans. So both of these individuals' work will be highly influential into Charles Darwin in helping him establish the fact that evolution of biological creatures was not an immediate process, but took a very long period of time for these changes to take place. The next scientist to influence Charles Darwin was that of John Baptiste de Lamarck, who lived from 1744 to 1829. Lamarck was a naturalist, and he wasn't the only one at the time to have similar ideas. Charles Darwin's own dad was a part of this movement too. But Lamarck came up with this theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And so what this meant was that if a characteristic was used by the organism, it would further develop and be passed on to their offspring. If the trait or characteristic was not used, it would regress and eventually not be passed on to the next generation because it wasn't needed. And Lamarck used fossil evidence really to come up with this theory. And like I said, he wasn't the first to propose this idea of how evolution takes place, but it was the mechanism by which he proposes evolution takes place that was new to the time. Ultimately, though, his theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics is incorrect. It was proven wrong, and we no longer continue to think this way. Here's an example of what Lamarck used for evidence of his inheritance of acquired traits. He would look at fossils, and he would look at fossils of organisms that were relatives of the giraffe. And so his idea was that as the giraffe needed to reach higher and higher for its food, the giraffe would stretch out its neck. And so the offspring of that giraffe then would have a slightly longer neck. And so they would then stretch out their neck over the course of their lifetime and pass that characteristic on to their offspring. And eventually we would have what we refer to as the modern giraffe with a long neck so it can eat vegetation from the top of the trees. Scientific studies have proven this is incorrect though, and it was really a false conclusion based on the fossil record that led Lamarck to this mechanism for evolution. This brings us to our final set of scientists that we're going to talk about for the development of the theory of evolution and ultimately the evidence that led to the support for this theory that was laid out by Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and lived to 1882. And we talked about his dad already. His dad was a naturalist and believed in the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin grew up believing in the theory of evolution. And so in 1831, Charles Darwin sets out on the HMS Beagle from Europe. And he does a trip around South America and eventually reaches the Galapagos Islands. It's here where Charles Darwin really makes the connection between different species and the means by which evolution takes place. Because the Galapagos Islands is far enough off the coast of South America that, geographically they're separated, but there are similar species between those found on the continent of South America and the islands. But because they've been separated for as long as they have, evolution has continued in different ways on the island compared to their continental counterparts. And so Charles Darwin set out, he studied the the finches that were found on the islands, the tortoises, the different fossils, and he eventually develops his means by which evolution takes place, and it's this idea of natural selection. Okay, Charles Darwin himself doesn't use the term evolution at all in the manuscript that he's famous for, that supports the theory of evolution. But really what he was interested in was determining a method by which a species could evolve over time. And so after returning from his trip to the Galapagos Islands in South America, Charles Darwin spent the next few years working on his manuscript, and he finished this manuscript in 1844. Now, at that time, scientific community was fairly spread out, and so they would have meetings periodically to discuss the major developments in the scientific community. But scientists would produce these manuscripts, and they would share them with their contemporaries and their peers at the time, and receive feedback from them on whether to publish or not. So Charles Darwin sends his manuscript to Lyell, who we already talked about. And Lyell, who doesn't necessarily believe in evolution, does think that there's enough evidence here that he should publish it. Well, Charles Darwin does not publish it. Instead, 1858 rolls around, and The Origin of Species still has not been published. Another scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, comes along, and he sends his manuscript to Darwin before presenting his research in front of the scientific community. And Wallace came to the same conclusions that Charles Darwin did, in that natural selection plays an important part in evolution, and that when we look at fossils and living representatives of those species, we can see how natural selection plays a role. So that year, Wallace, along with Lyell, present the research to the scientific community. They also include parts of the manuscript that had been written by Darwin and not published. In 1859, Charles's manuscript is finally published as The Origin of Species. Now, today we remember Charles Darwin for his work. He is the father of the theory of evolution, but it was not just his work that led to the theory. And really, Charles Darwin and Wallace are both credited with developing the means by which evolution takes place, especially after the incorrect methods that have been proposed by previous scientists. Now on this page here I have a picture of some of the Galapagos finches, and you're going to have an activity coming up here soon where we're going to look at the different beaks of the finches to talk about how evolution takes place in natural selection. And so again, going back to that binomial naming, we have three of the same species, Geospiza, and then we have one of genus Certhidia. When you're done watching this video, we'll have some questions to answer about the finches. I want you to look at the beaks here and think about what these beak sizes could be, what could be the reason for the evolution of the different sizes of beaks. Why do all these finches on the Galapagos Islands have the size beaks they have? The next video that we'll start will deal with natural selection and artificial selection in the week to come. Thank you.